Hi, and welcome to episode 2 of Scoop and Scale, a podcast where we dish up and weigh the facts about mostly equine nutrition, although anything horse-related is fair game on this podcast. I'm veteran equine editor and content strategist Michelle Anderson. I own Cadence Marketing and Media, where I help veterinarians and horse businesses connect with horse owners. I'm a trail rider, a dressage rider, and an at-home horse keeper.
And I'm independent equine nutrition consultant, Dr. Clair of Clarity Equine Nutrition. I create individualized diet plans for horses, ranging from metabolic seniors to Olympic athletes. I also consult for equine nutrition companies and help them with their formulations. I'm a scientist, dressage rider, and pony club mom.
Claire and I worked together for years, her writing hundreds of articles about equine nutrition, and me assigning those topics and editing the content for a popular digital newsletter and website. We also did several live events and podcast episodes together.
And when we were done working, we always found we had far more to talk about than we were supposed to, usually about our personal horses, our riding, new research, or things going on in the equine industry in general. So we decided to invite you all along for those conversations with this podcast.
Yeah, and I'm just going to add that we started this meeting an hour ago, and we're just now starting to record. So that's how much chit-chatting we had to catch up on before we got started.
So true.
Today, we're talking about vitamin E and why it's an important part of your horse's diet. Now, before we jump into vitamin E, I want to introduce a new segment on our second episode called Michelle Asks Claire for Free Equine Nutrition Advice. So, I have a question for you from my own herd. I have a gelding. He's just about to turn 20. He's been diagnosed with PPID. We find it challenging to get him to eat or take his percent, which has been prescribed by our veterinarian. What recommendations do you have to get him to eat that pill?
Yeah, you are not alone in that problem. Yeah, rest assured, it's really tricky. So PPID is the abbreviation for pars pituitary intermediary dysfunction, and that's the actual kind of like scientific veterinary name for Cushing's. A lot of people, we just know it as Cushing's. So if you weren't sure what PPID is, that's Cushing's. And yeah, we have this pill called Percend that helps slow down the progression of that disease, but it's not very tasty. And a lot of horses just don't want to eat it. And yeah, it's tricky, right? So a couple of things you can try. I mean, you know, the easy things most people try are like taking a bit of carrot or a bit of apple and like cutting a hole out of it and sticking the pill in and shoving it back in their mouth and hoping to goodness that does it. And for some horses, you're lucky that does it. There are some like treats out on the market that I think Stanley make a pill pocket treat that has a soggy middle. And there are some others out there as well, I think I've seen, although I don't recall the name of them. You can do things like pitted prunes. So you can take a pitted prune, and that's almost like a natural pill pocket, right? Maybe dates. Again, you have to take the stone out. Don't feed it with the stone. You take the stone out, then it makes the hole to put the pill in, right? I have a friend who used to be a vet tech, and she rather cleverly started using the glycerine pill, what do you call those? Like the capsules, right? When you get medication in a capsule with powder in it, that's a gelatin or capsule. And I think you can buy those on Amazon, and you can put the pill in that, because I think sometimes what it is if that pill touches their tongue, it doesn't taste good, right? And so then they just have that association. But if you put it in the gelatin capsule, it doesn't dissolve onto their tongue when it gets wet, and so then they don't taste it. So that can be really helpful. I've heard of quite good success with that.
Yeah, that's something that my vet did recommend, and I haven't tried yet. It feels like we keep having to try different things, and nothing's perfect. Dates worked, so I did think of that. But then I was concerned about the sugar. We aren't supposed to give these horses. Right? Is there enough sugar in a date to make a difference?
I mean, I think if your horse is stable, right? So hopefully when you got your diagnosis, you also checked insulin values. That's unfortunately something that doesn't always get done. I'm always telling people, if you're going to test for Cushing's, test for their insulin values as well, because you need to know, are they also insulin dysregulated and elevated insulin? Because if they are, you know, you need to be a little bit more careful than if they're just PPID. But if they're not laminitic, their insulin's well controlled, I'm not concerned about, giving them one date a day. I don't, in the scheme of things, we tend to get a little fixated about that and not think about the 20 pounds of untested hay that we're feeding, which goodness knows how much sugar is in that. That's going to have way more sugar in that than you're going to get in one date. And if that's what you need to get that pill in the horse, to me, it's a risk assessment where I'm like, I'm willing to risk a few grams of sugar in a date to get the medication in him that ultimately is going to help control his insulin, help slow the progression of the disease, right? It's kind of that trade-off. So, but yeah, they can, just because it works this week, unfortunately, doesn't mean to say it's going to work next week.
Yeah.
So you need to have
a big bag of tricks is what it feels like.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And we did check his insulin levels and they were good. So we had that going for us. So, and we will keep giving him his natural candy, those dates, the big Costco things of dates. So.
Yes. God bless Costco, right?
So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into our conversation about vitamin E. I think we should start with the basics. When I think of vitamin E, or at least before it became a popular topic with horse people, I always thought of it as like for human skincare. Maybe an oil or serum if you had a scar that you would put on to try to help with the healing. But what is vitamin E and why do our horses need it?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So I'm going to start with the second part of that question, the why vitamin E, right? So horses don't synthesize vitamin E, right? So it is dietary. It's a dietary essential nutrient, meaning they have to have it in their diet because it is a required compound for them and they don't make it. It's interesting. It's a non-enzymatic antioxidant, right? So there are antioxidants in the body that are enzymes, like superoxide dismutase. That's like an enzyme, but vitamin E is not an enzyme. So it's kind of unique in that way. And it's also unique because it's not actually required for any specific metabolic function. It has a broad range of functions, not just like a function. And what's interesting about it is that it gets incorporated into the cell membranes around cells. So it's a fat soluble vitamin. It's one of our fat soluble vitamins. And so if we kind of, dig back through our minds back to like high school biology, you might remember that cells have what's called a lipid bilayer around them with, fat that's kind of, you probably drew a bunch of little circles with sticks on the bottom and drew a line and the other way too, right? So they have this lipid bilayer. And so vitamin E gets incorporated into that bilayer around the cells and it helps protect the integrity of the cell membrane. So it's really important that our horses have enough vitamin E because when they don't have enough vitamin E, they're unable to protect their cells as well. And then it also has an effect on like cell-mediated immunity as well. So it has a lot of important roles. It as I say, it's part of your cell structure. As to what it actually is, vitamin E is kind of a catch-all term, right? So it's actually a collective term for 8 different compounds, right? So there are 4 like tocopherols and 4 what are called tocotrienols, and they have different chemical structures, and we lump them all together and we just say, oh, it's vitamin E. They have different activity based on their chemical structure, and the one that's known as alpha tocopherol, that's recognized as having the biologic vitamin E activity. So that's actually what we're the most interested in when we're talking about a vitamin E. What we're actually talking about is alpha tocopherol because that's the one that has the most biologic activity. And so naturally occurring alpha tocopherol has a lot more biologic activity than the others. So that's kind of what vitamin E is, right? It's just a collective term for all these different chemicals. But generally, when we say vitamin E, we mean alpha tocopherol. So that's why when you look at supplements and things, it says some kind of alpha tocopherol. You're not seeing like gamma tocopherol or beta tocopherol, even though those things actually exist. We're not so interested in those because they don't have a lot of biologic activity.
Okay, so those fall under the broader umbrella, but aren't exactly what we need for our horses' health.
Yeah, we have it. There's been a little bit of research into gamma tocopherol. And in horses, interestingly, I think there was 1 or 2 papers in gamma tocopherol. And it's interesting because obviously when the horse eats their natural diet, they're eating all those tocopherols and tocotrienols, right? They're not exclusively eating alpha tocopherol. They are getting combinations. And so there is some research and some knowledge about gamma tocopherol, and there's more in the human literature, and sort of suggesting that actually when we have a lot of alpha tocopherol, we maybe exclude some of the gamma tocopherol. And gamma tocopherol is kind of interesting, but we don't know much about it, to be honest, at this point. And so it's, at this point in our research knowledge, when we're talking vitamin E, we're talking alpha tocopherol. But yes, there are other chemical structure forms of it out there, but we don't know enough about them to really, know what we need yet. So, yeah.
So I mentioned that it became more popular a few years ago. It seems like it's been a few years. I don't know. I'm getting older. Maybe it was longer than that.
Right?
But it became a popular topic, and we all started becoming concerned about if our horses were getting enough. You mentioned research that's been done on vitamin E. Why did we start looking into this, and why has it become a hot topic in the last few years?
Yeah, it has, hasn't it? I mean, it's certainly something that pops up somewhat frequently on social media and blog posts, and, people seem to have much more of an interest in it.
And in advertising.
Yeah, that too. But I think we've definitely, we've learned that vitamin E plays a critical role in some pretty nasty conditions that horses can suffer from. So it's a critical component of neuroaxonal dystrophy, NAD. It seems, with that particular condition, that if you have a horse that, and we don't know the genetics, right? It's important to understand we don't know the genetic cause of NAD, but there appears to be a genetic cause. If your horse has the genetic predisposition to NAD, and when they're young and growing, so like at some point in their first year, if they don't have adequate vitamin E at the right time, that switch can get switched on, and then they will develop NAD, which may not show up until 5-6 years of age or whatever. It might not show up until later in life. And so it's hard because, you buy a 5-6-year-old, you don't know what it was fed when it was 5 months old, 6 months old, right? But there is this vitamin E component to that condition. And that even it appears, again, we're still learning about this condition. It appears that even though you might be predisposed to it, if you have enough vitamin E at the right moments in time, you won't go down that pathway. So it's really important that we're testing vitamin E in our young horses and weanlings, and making sure that broodmares have enough vitamin E at the end of their pregnancy, so that enough vitamin E gets transferred in colostrum to foals. So that's one reason. Another reason is there's a condition called vitamin E deficiency muscle myopathy. And so if a horse is deficient in vitamin E for a period of time, they will start losing muscle mass and struggle to maintain top line, and will actually lose their muscle definition over their hind end. In a lot of horses, we see those, what I grew up calling poverty lines, those big kind of glute muscles down either side of the tail, and those kind of lines down either side, and just kind of the angular back end and not building top line. I mean, that's definitely a horse I'd be investigating. What's its vitamin E status, and is it getting enough vitamin E? And then, at the other end of the scale, the old horses that have maybe lived with a vitamin E deficiency for many, many years, it seems that may be linked to developing equine motor neurons disease later in life, right? So horses with equine motor neurons disease seem to have, lower levels of vitamin E than other horses. So is that a cause? I don't know. I'm not sure if we can say that yet, but there certainly seems to be a connection there. So that's important too. So certainly the longer a horse goes with low vitamin E, the kind of worse off it's going to be. And there was some really interesting work done by Dr. Finno at UC Davis, where they looked at horses that had even just marginal levels of vitamin E. So not flat out deficient, but just on the scale of what's deficient, what's okay. They were marginal. And those horses, they were already seeing a change in 4% of their muscle fibers when they looked at them under a microscope. And it's easy to say, 4% isn't very many. I would tend to look at that and go, oh my gosh, 4%? Like if you've got marginal vitamin E, like you're already seeing changes in muscle fibers, like where does that end? If you didn't do anything about that vitamin E marginal status and you left it for year after year after year, what effect would that have in the muscle health of that horse?
So where would a horse get vitamin E in the diet, and what would be some of the reasons that the horse might not be getting enough to support itself?
Right. So in their natural diet, like fresh forage, like good quality fresh forage, it actually can have quite high levels of vitamin E and alpha tocopherol. So it's, it could be as much as 30 to 100 IUs of vitamin E activity per kilogram of dry matter, which is quite a lot. But the problem is it's not heat stable. So even though your horse out on beautiful summer pasture is eating oodles of vitamin E, when we make hay and we cut that grass, and then what do? Right? We lay it out in the sun, hopefully, and kind of bake it to dry the grass out over 3 or 4 days before we bale it. That process of having it out in the sun is going to, cause a loss of vitamin E. And so it declines over time, not only during the actual curing stages, but also with storage. So there's been reports of, I think it's 54 to sort of low 70% loss of vitamin E in alfalfa that was stored for 12 weeks at 33 degrees Celsius. So it's losing, by the time it gets to your horse eating it, certainly late in the winter, I think nearly every horse, even if it's out all year round, at some point is relying pretty heavily on conserved hay or forage. So there's just not that much left in that hay-based diet. And of course, certainly where I am in Arizona, we don't have any pasture that's worth anything really, right? I mean, it's our horses are in all the time. The competition horses tend to be in all the time. All their forage is coming from hay, so they're never going to get, pasture.
Yeah, I'm going to say you're in the Arizona desert. I'm in the Oregon high desert. Without irrigation, my horses are dry lotted, and so that would put my horses and your horse at a higher risk then.
Right. Well, and I keep seeing pictures of all your horses playing in the snow. So, I mean, right? And that's the same for people.
It's a different desert. It's a different desert than that they live in.
That is very true. But I mean, the point being that like people that live in like Pennsylvania or Ohio or whatever, who have lots and lots of grass the rest of the year. I mean, right now it's under inches of snow. So, and even if it wasn't under inches of snow, it's dormant. It's not particularly, they're feeding hay. Right. So I have a little rule of thumb, like a little trick where, as people say, well, how much pasta do they have to meet their vitamin E? And, that's a really tough one. How much grass are they eating? We just don't really know. So my sort of common sense approach to it is that if you don't have to feed your horse any hay, if your horse can maintain himself just on pasture, then he's probably getting enough vitamin E from his pasture. But the moment you have to start adding hay into the diet to maintain condition, then I start to think that maybe we're not getting enough pasture to meet the vitamin E requirement, and you need to have vitamin E coming from somewhere else in the diet.
Yeah, and I feel like there was this idea like image of horses out on pasture in herd grazing, but for like the insulin resistant horse that might end up with laminitis, or a horse like mine with PPID that's at higher risk of laminitis. Like that's not really it's not part of their reality that they can be out on those pastures all the time. And so
right,
I'm thinking that those horses probably need to be looked at as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Because you're limiting their intake, and that they often struggle, right? They're often in sort of nutritional deficiency just through general lack of total amount of food that they can be fed because they're such easy keepers, Yeah.
So over the years, even before we started talking a lot about vitamin E, you would see on the shelves supplements that usually combine vitamin E and selenium, and they were talked about together. Often when you do testing with your veterinarian, that test is done together. Is there a relationship between vitamin E and selenium?
Yes, kind of in the fact that selenium is required. I mentioned before about that another antioxidant, superoxide dismutase, that requires selenium, right? So selenium is required for making that enzyme. And that is another antioxidant, and its job is very similar to vitamin E. So if you have, adequate amounts of SOD, then you may not need as much vitamin E, right? So it just kind of takes the pressure off vitamin E a little bit. And so in that sense, yes, they are kind of linked together. My problem with those supplements is that most supplements that are vitamin E selenium combo supplements are using inorganic forms of vitamin E that are not particularly bioavailable. So oftentimes you're going to think you're going to get, supplementing vitamin E and it's all good, when in actual fact, there's not a lot of bioavailability in that vitamin E supplement that you're giving. Most of those are not, you need something a little bit more potent than those supplements most of the time.
Yeah. And I live in an area where selenium is deficient. Our horses aren't likely to have a lot from their natural hay or pasture if they have access to pasture. But so I've always lived in this like selenium deficit mindset. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you can have too much. So do you recommend that people are looking at how much selenium their horses are getting before they just start throwing vitamin E, selenium supplements at them?
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. Selenium, it is, of our trace minerals, it is actually toxic, and at much lower quantities than, where you'd see issues with things like copper and zinc, for example, and they're not even really toxic per se. They just start having negative impacts on other trace minerals. But selenium, you can actually kill your horse if you feed too much selenium. Now, granted, people get very freaked out about selenium. I mean, and you still have to feed quite a lot of selenium to really have a negative health implication. But selenium creeps into the diet in funny ways, in supplements here and there. It's like 0.5 milligram here and 1 milligram there and 0.5 milligram over here. And the problem with, those vitamin E selenium supplements is that having the selenium in them prevents you from scaling up the amount you give, right? Which I think is kind of what you were getting at, right? You can't, let's say it comes with 0.5 milligram of selenium and 1,000 IUs of vitamin E, and you want to give your horse 5,000 IUs of vitamin E. Well, to do that, you're going to end up with 2.5 milligrams of selenium. And, in a lot of places in the US, that's going to be too much selenium, especially if you're feeding, say, a commercial ration balancer, which is already giving 1.5 milligrams of selenium, or, something else, one of these combo performance supplements, and your grain, which is also giving a milligram. You can get to 5 or 6 milligrams of selenium in the diet very quickly without realizing it. And that may or may not be okay. Depends where, for you in the Pacific Northwest might be great, but if you're like in the Dakotas or something where selenium's really high and the hay is going to have more selenium in it, well, you wouldn't want to be doing that. So yes, you do have to think about that. And it's one of the reasons, it's my second reason why I don't like selenium vitamin E combo supplements. The first is the vitamin E tends to be synthetic and not very bioavailable. And the second is I can't scale up how much I can give if I want more vitamin E without pushing the limits on the selenium.
Yeah. And not to go too far off on the selenium tangent, but I had an experience. We'll talk about salt in a future episode. I guarantee you that Claire and I are going to talk about salt because it's one of our favorite topics. But I don't buy it that often because it comes in giant bags and I give them out that Claire recommends to my horses every day. But I finally went through my big bag and I ordered some from the feed store, went to pick it up. They loaded it. I got it home and they had loaded the wrong bag and it was a salt that had selenium in it. And it was one of those things like as I was scooping, I went, hey, wait a second, this bag is different. So it's another one of those kind of sneaky ways that you might not be expecting, especially if you live in an area where there's a lot of livestock and that are being given it, supplemented that way. There's just sneaky ways that it ends up in your horse's diet. So
it sneaks in. I often find diets where I'm like, ooh, it's in that supplement. Ooh, it's in that. And owners haven't even noticed.
So back to vitamin E, do we know how much our horses really need to maintain their health?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we have guidelines, right, from the National Research Council, which seemed like they were published yesterday, but that was back in 2007. And it wasn't yesterday. They decided at that time not to really change the recommendations that much since the time before they came out with guidelines, which is in like the 1980s. So we haven't had any really big changes in vitamin E recommended requirements for quite a long time. there is research out there suggesting that those National Research Council guidelines are possibly on the low end of, what they really need. National Research Council suggests that for horses at maintenance, so that's just horses bumbling around, doing no forced exercise, not pregnant, that kind of thing, they do have a requirement of for 50 IUs per kilogram of dry matter in their diet, which equates to about 1 IU per kilogram body weight per day. So your 1,100 pound horse weighs 500 kilograms. And so he would need 500 IUs of vitamin E. Those requirements are for growth. They're not defined, right? So we're a little bit kind of guessing there, but we say 2 IUs per kilogram body weight recommended, and the same for lactating broodmares. And then for work, it goes up a little. It starts off at like 1.6, so higher than maintenance, but not quite as high as broodmares and growing, and then goes up to 2 for horses in heavy work. And that's because, as your horse is working, it's burning fuel, right? It's burning carbohydrates and fats. And that's where these oxidative byproducts come from that vitamin E is trying to get rid of, right? So I don't know if we really covered what it's really doing in a sense, but when you're metabolizing, especially fat. So when you burn fat is an oxidative metabolic process, right? So you're using oxygen to break that fat down and liberate the energy from it so the horse can get the energy that's in that fat. And one of the byproducts of that process are free radicals, right? They're oxidative byproducts, and those are damaging. They're things like peroxidase, right? So they peroxides and things, and peroxides can damage the cells. And so what you do is you have an antioxidant that comes along to the oxidant, and it actually donates part of itself to that oxidative product and stabilizes it so that it's no longer a free radical. It's no longer dangerous to the cell. You've stabilized it and kind of made it calm down. And so that's kind of what antioxidants do. They get rid of all this oxidative trash that's in cells. And so that's how they protect the cells. So the harder you're working your horse, the more that horse is burning fuel to do the work, it stands to reason that the more oxidative byproducts you're going to have. Similarly, the more fat you feed your horse, the more you're leaning on fat metabolism to get your horse energy, the more oxidative byproducts there are going to be. So that's one reason why when we feed high-fat feeds, we suggest that you feed more vitamin E to those horses because they're at risk of more oxidative damage because of the fat in the diet. So that's those are the NRC requirements. Now, the problem is that every horse is a little different, and we've learned that yes, natural vitamin E is more bioavailable and gets taken out of the gut more easily and goes into the bloodstream more easily. But once it goes to the liver and it gets metabolized and it's being sent out to all the cells in the body to do what it's supposed to do, that process is very individual horse to horse. So how they metabolize vitamin E varies greatly between individual horses. So you could have, 5 horses, all of a similar breed, all doing similar kind of work, all getting the same diet, and they'll have radically different vitamin E levels. So really, if you want to know what your horse's requirements are, you feed them to meet their NLC requirement, and then you have to test their levels.
So it's not just a matter of going and buying a bottle of a supplement and starting them on it and crossing your fingers and hope that okay.
No. And I used to do that, right? So when I first started consulting, I recommend to all my clients, we'd do the feed and the ration balancer or whatever we were doing, the performance feed. And then I'd recommend everybody give their horse 2,500 IUs of natural vitamin E. It's just sort of a, just in case, thing. And then I started, talking to the researchers that really work in vitamin E and these muscle diseases and the like. And I learned about this individual variation. And I was just kind of like, really? And I was in a big dressage barn and I had a client who was there and she had 3 horses and there were 2 warm bloods and a quarter horse. And she was feeding them the exact same amount of vitamin E and they were all working kind of 2nd, 3rd level. And I said, would you, she's like, I'll test vitamin E. So she had her blood out. She had them pull blood and we looked at the results. One was outside high, like above normal, high. One was like right in the middle of the normal range and one was deficient. And, her diet, I think she was feeding at least twice the NRC requirement of vitamin E on paper. So on paper, I was like, well, you're home clear because, you're feeding twice what they're supposed to get. But the horses thought otherwise.
Since it is a fat-soluble vitamin, correct? And then is there a risk then in over-supplementing if the horse that had too high levels, if that horse have experienced any consequences from that?
Yeah, so if it is too much, then it can actually have issues with bone metabolism. It'll also potentially have issues with like the membrane function. You actually start to change the structure of the membranes and things. So especially like red blood cells start to have issues and things. So yeah, more is not better when it comes to vitamin E. Research in other species suggests that we should be able to feed up to 10,000 IUs, to an average size horse without a problem. But there are some horses, in conversations I've had with veterinarians where they're treating, specific conditions and they're giving 10,000 IUs of even the most bioavailable form. And that horse is still, barely in range for where it should be. It's also really interesting that what we call normal range and what we would actually see on a horse that's on really good quality pasture, the horses that are on really good quality pasture often have vitamin E levels that are much higher than what we've traditionally considered normal. And again, so some of those researchers that are working on this kind of thing, the labs are actually moving to expand their normal range and actually make it higher. So the units used to be, and I'm forgetting the units off the top of my head, this is what happens, but it's like deficient is less than 1.5. 1.5 to 2 is normal. 2 to 4. 1.5 to 2 is marginal, and 2 to 4 is normal. But you'll have horses coming off of good quality pasture. The research have sort of found that, 6, 7, even 8. And so they're not that concerned anymore. If they have somebody who has a hay-based diet and is supplementing or whatever, and their horses come back with a 6, they're not too concerned by that, even though that's outside of the traditional normal range, because that's what you'll see in horses on good quality pasture. And in fact, some of them would say, we're actually, for a long time, I've said, you want to be at the upper end of normal. So if the normal range is 2 to 4, you want to be at 4, not at 2, right? Especially with performance horses. And again, some of the less dramatic symptoms of vitamin E deficiency are just things like muscle soreness, right? And not being able to recover as quickly as you would like, not building top line the way you would like. And so the performance horses in particular, I think it's good to have them at that higher end of normal, up around 4. But if your values are coming back at like 6, you're fine. But once it starts getting up, 10, 13, like that's too high.
Yeah. Well, I think that the blood testing to check is relatively inexpensive compared to everything else that we do, right? So it really is an easy thing to add to that spring checkup with your vet.
Yeah, it is. And I think that, I would suggest you do it every year, and just find out, is your base diet putting your horse where it needs to be? I think spring's a nice time to do it as well, because for most horses, you're coming off a long winter of being on hay. So they're going to be like this time of year, we're like middle of March right now. Like for those horses that have, on pasture until late fall, but have been on hay all winter, they're probably about as low as they're going to be in their 12-month kind of calendar cycle, right? So if you're going to catch a deficiency, like now's the time I would expect you to catch it, just because of the fact you don't have that quality pasture, or they haven't had quality pasture for several months.
I know that you're a fan of ration balancers, of high quality ration balancers for horses as kind of a starting point for diets. Is that ration balancer going to cover a horse's vitamin E needs, or is it we need to go do testing and find out?
On paper, right? So the better ones are probably giving you about 1,000 IUs per pound. And again, horses in hard work technically NRC says they need about 2 IUs per kilogram body weight. So that's right around 1,000 IUs. But the problem is that most of your vitamin E that's being used in feeds is synthetic and isn't going to be absorbed as well. It's potentially been in contact with trace minerals like copper and zinc, and it's not a particularly stable compound. So that, that's one of the reasons why. So when you look at your labels on your feed bags, you'll see it labeled often as like vitamin E supplement. Like if it's natural, they're going to tell you it's natural. Natural is way more expensive, right? So my sort of rule of thumb is if they don't tell you natural vitamin E, or if they don't put alpha tocopherol or alpha tocopherol acetate, it's not natural. It's going to be synthetic, right? You'll see acetate forms because acetate forms, they're slightly less bioavailable, but they're much more stable, right? So they're much better in a commercial feed where you've got copper and zinc and other things that could really get rid of the bioactivity of that vitamin E. So I don't mind seeing, alpha tocopherol acetate, D-alpha tocopherol acetate. If it just says vitamin E supplement, it's probably synthetic. If it says DL alpha tocopherol, that's synthetic, right? So D-alpha is natural, DL alpha is synthetic.
So as a horse owner, walking away from this conversation, I'm trying to think what the take-homes are. Natural over synthetic. Mm-hmm. The natural is going to cost more, but you get what you pay for. What I'm hearing. Yeah. Our horses get this from fresh forage diets, but that's not always accessible. So they probably are at risk for a deficiency, and blood tests work with your vet to make sure that your horse does or doesn't need vitamin E in their diet.
Right. Absolutely. And the natural form comes in a lot of different types of supplements, right? I mean, it comes in powders and pellets and there's water soluble and there's oil, natural in oil. And, if you diagnose a deficiency, then sort of the gold standard is you put them on the water soluble liquid vitamin E. And that's expensive. But it gets the job done. It's been shown to raise blood levels of vitamin E within hours, right? So that's really where you want to go. If you have an actual deficiency, go there. But once you fix a deficiency with that water-soluble vitamin E, you don't necessarily have to keep them on that forever, right? So you can gradually, in consultation with your veterinarian and checking blood work, you can wean them off that and wean them onto a less expensive natural form of vitamin E, right? So you might gradually, find the deficiency, you fix it with the water-soluble liquid, you fix it because you take more blood work, and then you say, okay, let's start weaning them onto another form of natural vitamin E that's more, pocketbook friendly, right? And as I said, that comes in lots of different forms. You can get natural in oil, which has the benefit of being, because it's fat soluble, if it's in oil, it's potentially going to help it be absorbed. It comes in a powder. You can get it in pellets. The key is not to go cold turkey off your water soluble onto your other form. Like it needs to be a gradual weaning. And typically, if let's say you started off with 5,000 IUs of the water soluble, you might, keep it at 5,000 and add a little bit of extra and then pull a little bit down and sort of, it's not an apples to apples conversion is my point. Is the powders and the oil liquids and the pellets are not quite as bioavailable. So 5,000 IUs of that is not going to be as effective as 5,000 of your water soluble. So you may find yourself having to feed a little bit more, but you should be able to switch off. But again, you don't make that assumption, right? Once you've got them on whatever your more pocketbook friendly form is, you then have to test them again and make sure that is actually being effective. And there are some horses out there that just have to be on the water soluble stuff.
Well, that wraps up the time that we have to talk about vitamin E today. As always, I've learned something chatting with you, Claire. My mares are headed to the vet here in a few weeks for their spring vaccines and travel paperwork for show season. So I'm definitely going to have blood pulled and test their vitamin E and selenium. My fingers crossed. We'll see where we're at.
Yeah, you'll have to let us know.
Yeah, when I get those results, you can help me make a plan with my vet's oversight. And so we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear. It's always fascinating to see the variation between individual horses, and the only way you can tell is to test.
We hope that those of you listening have learned something new too, and that it will help you take better care of your horses. If you'd like to be part of our conversations in the future, please send your suggestions for topics and equine nutrition questions to info@scoopandscale.com and to spell that. You can also find Claire at clarityequine.com. For the Scoop and Scale podcast, I'm Michelle Anderson.
And I'm Dr. Claire Tunis.
Thanks for riding along with us.